I knew that when I was going to be teaching or launching this unit, I wanted to begin with the end in mind. I thought about what I wanted the students to learn. I wanted them to use the language of the standard, specifically American Indians, the regions, how they obtain clothing, shelter, food, based upon the environment that they were living in. And I thought the best way to do that, as these are elementary students, is to use those words that help them dig deeper into questioning. And I knew once they started questioning, this would open up Pandora's box, and we would be able to synthesize and put ideas together and just come to the ending, which is how the American Indians used their environment. I knew that the students would get all of that once we started digging into questions and evaluating where they were, what they needed to know, what I wanted them to know. And inquiry has really changed the way I've taught, because I see that it's easy. It's easy for anyone to do. Once you come up with a plan of where you want the students to be and what you want them to learn, then you can kind of scaffold backwards and come up with the questions in your mind that the students should be asking as they're learning these standards. And it has really changed the way I have viewed using questioning in my lesson planning. The first step that you need to take when getting started with a lesson on inquiry is understanding the standard. Go back to the old school way of unpacking the standard, taking it bit by bit and seeing what it is that you want the students to accomplish. So really, a lesson on inquiry is understanding the standards. Once you know the standard and you understand it, believe me, the lesson and the inquiry and the skill, it'll just flow like water. Okay, guys, before we begin, I want to review some standards with you that's going to help drive your instruction. Looking at the standards that we're going to cover, and you've got the purple sheet at your table. So as I go through the standards, I want you to also look at the standards at your table if you're able to, or not, you can just look at the easel. So we're also going to compare and contrast how American Indians in each region use their environment to obtain food, clothing, and shelter. Who can tell me what environment means? What does it mean when I say use your environment? Delaney.
It means to use the things around you. Like if somebody lived by the woods, they would use wood, and if somebody lived by the desert, they would usually use clay.
Perfect. So we're talking about things that are around you. We're going to also discuss how American Indians continue to contribute to the American life. For example, how about their arts and literature? So we're going to try to make a connection with that. We're also going to explain why American Indian groups occupied the areas that they did, with emphasis on why some developed permanent villages in certain places and others did not. So I want you to keep these things in your mind as we start the lesson. Keep those standards in your mind. So we're going to look at our essential question, which is going to be the big overarching question that by the end of the lesson, you should be able to make some connections and answer. Before we begin, I want to talk to you a little bit about inquiry or questioning. I've got these shoes here, and they're called gitas. With your table, I want you to ask some questions about the gitas. What questions might you ask each other about this? Or what questions might you ask Mrs. Rogers about these? Take about 30 seconds, and I want you to brainstorm or come up with some questions that you might have about these gitas. Go ahead.
So maybe they are like, they probably, so like they have teeth, so they probably go and stomp on the dead ants.
I feel like it's probably not snowshoes, but do you think it's maybe desert or water? So you won't really step in the water?
It looks like they would slip right off his feet. But I'm also wondering how they make the designs with...
Finish up your thought. And then I want you to think about the questioning that you did. Now, as I walked around, I heard some really wonderful questions. Well, when we start talking about looking at the standards or discussing questioning, I always talk to the students about what it is like to produce a good question. What are some things that we should be looking for when we're writing our questions? For example, one of the rules is not to judge. It is human nature to say, oh, well, that's self-explanatory. You don't need to ask that question. But yes, you do. Another one is to not answer those questions, because it is human nature to ask a question and then someone go, well, here's the answer. We don't want to be the catalyst for the students to answer those questions. We want the students to ask the questions, but then through the process of the lesson, reflect back to the standard, use their maps and their resources that they have available to them, and the questions will be answered through themselves. There's no need for us to deliver the answer to them. We're just holding them accountable for their learning. What question, does anybody want to share a question that they might have had? Brady Kate, what question might you have had?
I'm wondering what region they belong to.
What region they might have belonged to?
Because the design, they have teeth on the bottom, so I'm wondering the blocks. So I'm wondering if it's the certain region, if there's a lot of sand, it might help them with the sand.
Okay, what did you wonder?
What I wondered was, what are they made of, and what environment they were in.
Okay, what they're made of, what environment they were in. Braden?
I wonder if that design could have been the design that made flip-flops.
Okay, he wonders if this design perhaps was the design that made flip-flops. Jose, what do you wonder?
I wonder if it's either modern or ancient, because it looks modern, but it could also be ancient.
Wonderful. I loved that you guys were asking, and if we look at the bulletin board here, that really made me excited, because wondering is part of inquiry, which is a part of questioning. You were asking important questions that had to do with these gitas. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this at the end of the lesson, but I want you to keep this in your mind. I want to tackle what we're going to do today. What we're going to do today is I want you to ask some questions that relate to the standards that we just focused on, okay? You're going to be asking some questions that relate to the standards that we just focused on a little bit. But before you start that, there's some rules of questioning that I do want to talk with you about. Rules for producing really good questions. Here are the rules. You are going to ask as many questions about the graphic organizer that I'm going to provide for you to look at. Ask as many questions as you can. Do not stop to discuss, judge, or answer any of the questions that anyone at your table has. When I say judge, what do I mean by judge? Do not judge. Do not stop to judge. June?
Maybe making fun of their idea and telling them, why don't you know that?
Right. So we're not going to judge what they've said. We're just going to go with it. We're brainstorming here. I want you to write down, the scribe in your group will write down every question exactly how it is stated. So however someone said the question, the scribe will write that question down. You're going to change any statement into a question. Change a statement into a question. Then what I want you to do is to number your questions. As many questions as you have, you're going to number them. You're going to be using divergent thinking to come up with your questions. You're using divergent thinking to come up with your questions. You're going to have 7 minutes to look at the graphic organizer and to write as many questions down as your group can think about. I want you to turn the graphic organizer over that's on your table. Also, while you're writing your questions down, don't forget that you also have access to your raised relief map. I want you to think about what the pictures or images represent, and then go ahead and begin writing your questions Now, questions, yes.
I was gonna ask, are we gonna do closed-end and open-ended questions?
You can if you prefer. All right, go ahead.
So maybe like where did they get their paint from? Like how did they make their color?
Go ahead and write your questions down.
But I actually think they do that to represent their ancestors. Okay. Do we have any more questions about this one, or should we move to the plains?
Let's ask you a question about something else.
Okay, and we can always come back. The plains is in the middle, so I think like around Kansas and Oklahoma. So.
And there's like a lot of teepees. It shows on the map. There's a lot of grass.
Just grass.
Just grass.
So and that's either snow or it's a black and white picture.
Yeah. That looks like teepees.
I think this is a desert.
Yeah.
Right here.
Well, no, this is desert.
How did the American Indians make their saws to cut their ice? To cut the ice to make an igloo. Cut the ice for Italy. For their...
Why did they make their houses out of logs?
Yeah, and like where did they get the logs?
Yeah, where did they get the logs?
Well, it is a little bump.
About 2 more minutes. Write as many questions down. Anything that you're wondering.
In the tundra, they would have to go like fishing for the animals because most of them live in the water.
Start coming to a stopping place. When you've written the last question, go ahead and put your marker down. Let's have a quick conversation. So we talked about the rules for producing good questions. Can someone tell me what was the most difficult of all of those rules to follow? What was the most difficult as you were asking those questions? What was the most difficult rule to follow? Natalie?
To not judge the question.
To not judge the question. Because what did you automatically want to do?
Judge the question, like say, oh, that's not really a very good question, or they probably got, like one of our questions was how did they get their clothes? And Andrew said, well, maybe they got it from animals.
Right. So it was just hard to just listen to the question and not jump in and say, well, I'll tell you how to do that. What was most difficult for you, Sam?
Trying not to answer it.
Trying not to answer the question. Mimi, what was difficult for you?
I thought it was difficult to like get all the questions down.
Okay, James, what was difficult?
I thought it was hard for Mimi to get all the questions down because we were all like talking at once and she was like,
Right, so you just kind of have to pace yourself and go slow. But keep those questions in your mind for the person that is writing. Grace, what was most difficult for you out of all the rules?
It was also hard not to discuss the question.
Yes, it was difficult not to discuss because human nature says, I want to answer that question, but we're just getting down our thoughts on papers. All right, so we're going to move on. Okay, so now we are going to go to the next step in this process. And I want to talk with you about open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. What does that sound like to you? Open-ended questions, closed-ended questions. James.
it sounds like a word, like a question, and it's like elaborate.
Elaborate. Oh, I like that word. So James says it sounds like it's elaborate. What does it sound like to you?
So close-ended, I feel like...
We're going to focus on open, and then we'll go to close. So what does open-ended sound like to you?
It sounds like kind of what James said, but you can like speak, you can explain it.
You can explain. Anybody else want to share? Brady, Kate?
It feels like there's lots to talk about it.
Lots of talk about it. I like that one. Lots of talk about it. So open-ended feels like it could be something that you elaborate on. It's something that you explain. There's a lot of conversation or talk about it. Delaney?
I think that the open-ended question is kind of like, I can relate this kind of to the word said, a closed-ended where you can't really go as far as you can because it's only a yes or no.
So with the open ending, you can go far.
You can go farther than a
Right, I like that. You can go farther with your answer. Okay. You can go further with your answer.
and your question.
Oh, and okay, and your question. Let's talk about closed-ended. Let's see how we can compare those two. What does a closed-ended question look like, sound like, feel like? Ian?
Closed-ended, you can answer with one word, yes, no.
One word. Yes or no. Like that. Diamond?
It's a short answer.
It's a short answer. What would be an example of that? Diamond, what would be an example of that?
If I say, what's your name? And you have just, oh, my name is this.
Right.
My name is that.
We know that that's what it's going to be, right? Brady, Kate, what are you thinking for closed-ended questions?
Yeah, because open-ended, it means a lot. Open and closed are pretty much opposites, so you'd know closed-ended was the opposite. Like I'm piggybacking off of everyone else. There's not much to say about it.
Not much to say about it. So, for instance, your mom says, did you clean your room? Are you going to give her an open-ended or closed-ended? Closed-ended.
I'll give her
And say that again?
Most likely it's no.
Most likely it's no, right?
I will give her an open-ended, like a whole entire explanation why I did not clean my room.
Okay, I like that too. Jose?
It's unextended.
It's unextended. Oh, that's interesting. Unextended. All right, so here we go. So you've got an idea of what the open-ended question is. We said there's a lot of talk about it. We can explain it, we can elaborate on it, we can go further with our answer. And then we said a closed-ended is usually a yes or no. Not much to say about it. And as Jose said, it's unextended. It's just short and to the point. I want you to look at your questions with your table. This is where you are going to put a C for closed-ended questions if the question on your paper is a closed-ended question, or an O if it is an open-ended question. Keep these rules in mind and refer to the chart. Now, if it's an open-ended question, somewhere on your paper, I want you to change it to a closed-ended question. And if it is a closed-ended question, just one example of each, I want you to change it to an open-ended question. So I want you to kind of have that accountability talk with one another, and I want you to do those two things for me. You're going to label your questions with a C or an O if it is a closed-ended or an open-ended question. And if it is, you're going to change it if it's a closed to an open, change it if it's an open to a closed. Just one example of each. Yes?
So that's what I was going to ask.
Yes, just one example of each, all right? You'll have about 4 minutes to do that. Go ahead.
Why do the people in the planes have teeth instead of pouches?
Open-ended. What do totem poles stand for?
Why are there arrows pointing in different places? They would have to explain why. Why Where are those? Are there animals on the poles? That's an open-ended question.
Okay, so now we gotta...
Now we have to change them.
Because if you make a roof with ice, it's just going to fall down if you don't have anything to stick it with. What do they eat?
Open to close.
Okay. What do they eat? Open.
Make sure you're able to identify what you've changed. So let's have a conversation about this. Let's have a conversation. Who wants to share what they've done? Did anybody notice that they had maybe all open-ended questions, which are questions that we can just talk a lot about, or explain, or elaborate? Or did anybody notice that they had all closed-ended questions, and it was just a yes and a no, and you can't go any further? Let's hear from you, Delaney. What did your group? I'm going to go around to each group quickly.
Kind of had a mix of both, of open-ended and closed-ended.
Okay.
So the first one that we did was number 1. It was open-ended question. What are they building? You have to tell them what they're building and explain what materials are made and why they're building it. And so we made that into a closed-ended question. Are they making a house?
Ah, nice.
Or no.
Nice.
We had a question just like that. So,
Nice.
Like Elisa. And then we had number 10, which was a closed-ended question. How many people do the houses hold?
Oh.
So we turned into an open. How can they make the buildings bigger to hold more people?
Nice responses. I like that. All right, guys, I think that I saw some really nice questions, and I love the way that you were able to think about. Did you find that by having to change the open to a close and the close to an open, did you have to really do some deeper digging and some deeper thinking about that question? Yeah, this is to just make you aware of what these questions are asking. I want you to highlight 3 questions that you think will help you to better understand the standards. Go.
Really, how did they get the wood to... I wrote this question wrong. I meant to say, how did the...
Keep the standards in mind, how it's going to help you to understand.
That could help us understand how they got their food and how they got it. So.
What is the environment?
Oh yeah, or there's mountains in the background.
Okay, that's good because...
But what would be our third question?
I'd just like to hear a few of your questions that you highlighted. Remember, we want to highlight questions that are going to help us to understand the standard a lot better. Jose, can I hear one of your questions?
One of the questions is number 8, and it's an open-ended question.
I love it.
It says, what materials did they use?
Ah, I like that. He said that that's one question that will help him to understand the standard. What materials did they use, and how did you relate that question to the standard? Where did you get that from?
It says It says in B, compare and contrast how American Indians in each region use their environment to obtain food, clothing, and shelter.
Love it. And what did you guys come up with?
We came up with what gods do they worship, number 12, because
What made you ask what gods do they worship?
Because it would explain the culture.
It would explain the culture. I like that. Okay, go ahead.
what do they build their houses with?
And what would that help you explain?
The materials.
The materials. And where does that fit in with the standard?
Where they live, their environment. Where their region is,
Yeah,
because of what kind of their environment.
their environment. And the last one?
What are the wooden poles?
What are the wooden poles? And what would that help you to understand? Culture. I saw the students thinking like geographers instantly when I handed them the raised relief maps and I gave them the graphic organizer where the tribes, with the environment of where the tribes lived. And it was like magic. I mean, they said, well, Miss Rogers, if the Northwest American Indians lived in this region, well, naturally, that makes sense that their homes were made of wood. And if the Southwest lived in this region, so it was like a light bulb just went off in their head. And as a historian, we often have to make connections between the present and the past, and that is what my students did. We as teachers must allow students think time. We don't do enough of that. We want to get to the lesson, teach the standard, and move on. And the problem here with that is that when we're spoon feeding these children, they don't get the meat of the lesson. So for me, the challenge was being able to step back and act more as a facilitator and not the teacher. If you notice, I delivered the instruction and I stepped back. I believe that once we hold students accountable for their learning, and this is done through the questioning and reassuring them that it's all right to ask these questions, and this is your show. This is what I want you to learn. This is what I want you to get from the standard. And working backwards, I was able to give them that essential question and repeatedly remind them through the lesson what the focus is here, what the big overarching question is that I want them to learn. They're going to stay engaged because they know that at some point they've got to answer that essential question. I'm going to hold them accountable for answering that question, and they cannot help but stay engaged to figure out how these American Indians use their environment, their clothing, their food, and interacted with it. All right, so there are index cards at your table. I would like for everyone to grab a pencil and grab an index card. Go ahead and put your standard in the middle of the table because we're going to refer to that again. Okay, guys, so now we've got the index cards that were in your container there in front of you. And I want to revert back to the standard, or the essential question, actually using the standard that we turned into an essential question. On your index card, I would like for you to answer that essential question. Go ahead. And when you have your thoughts down, come to a stopping place as soon as you can. How does questioning or inquiry help us explain how American Indians in each region use their environment to obtain food, clothing, shelter, and how they contribute to American life? Does anybody want to share? I saw Brady, Kate, and June's hand go up. So I'll start with Brady, Kate. Could you read to us and tell us how using questioning helped you?
Okay, so it's not really about American Indians as much as it is about inquiring anything.
Okay,
So
let's hear it.
When you question different topics, you will get a better understanding of what you are learning. If you just sit at your seat and do nothing, you don't learn as much. When you participate, you most likely stay awake and on task.
I love that. All right, Sam, let's hear how inquiry helped you to understand, or questioning helped you to understand.
You usually you learn more about it, and then when you get into higher grades, you usually know more about it.
What does your card say?
It says, inquiry helps you to understand American Indians by learning about their past and all about what they wore and where they slept and what they ate. Without inquiry, we will know nothing about American Indians.
That's amazing. I really like that. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. What were these called again? Gaitas. I want to leave you with this thought. Every culture wears shoes, correct? Yes. I want you to think about, as we end this, what might the culture have been like that wore these shoes? I want you to think about that. Not share with me, but I would like you to think about that. Think about the culture that wore these gaitas. And think about how they might have adapted to their environment within their region, and how these shoes would have served a purpose for that culture. The literacy piece is self-explanatory. I mean, we've got students that are, you can go a little bit deeper into this lesson also. This is kind of to launch a lesson, but the next piece of this lesson that I had was I was tying in some fables from each American Indian tribe and using that as my literacy piece, and not necessarily telling the students where these fables come from, but having them through their connections from the beginning of the lesson and learning about the regions, learning about the clothing, learning about the environment, putting it together and kind of figuring out, well, this fable goes with this American Indian tribe. So that's where you can tie in that literacy piece and the fluency within the literacy piece. The poetry, you can introduce some poetry along with this unit. And as we know, as teachers, poetry is great for inducing that fluency within students, having them recite them. One of the standards call for speaking and listening. Have your students stand up and recite a piece of poetry from a tribe, or read the fable from the tribe. So those are ways that later on in the lesson I have tied in the literacy and fluency piece along. When I knew that I was going to be planning this lesson, looking at the standards, I knew that it focused on American Indians and the regions in which these American Indians lived. Automatically, I said to myself, well, if we're going to talk about regions, we have to have a map. So I pulled out the raised relief maps, and within that lesson, I reviewed what types of landforms do you see on these maps? And I knew that if I could have the students connecting to that map while focusing on the standard, thinking about the regions that these American Indians live, I knew that it would be a marriage that would be complete. I also knew that I wanted the students to do some writing. I wanted the students to do some illustrating. And I knew that I needed, to have my chart paper, to have my maps, to have my index cards for reflection. So like I said, once you begin with the end in mind, you can kind of scaffold backwards, and it all just really lends itself to developing a lesson plan that's out of this world. I love what I do. I think it's a part of who I am. I cannot imagine not teaching these students. I was put on earth to do this. I was put on earth to be a facilitator, because I don't necessarily want to think of myself as a teacher. These students bring joy to my life. And I could come in upset, but as soon as I see one of their faces, I forget what I was upset about. I enjoy creating a curiosity within them. I enjoy stimulating them to ask questions. I enjoy hearing what they have to say, because they have a lot to say. Sometimes as adults, we need to listen to children. I know it's successful when I'm walking them to the restroom and one girl turns to me and says, "This is the most I've ever gotten out of a lesson in social studies." And then the rest of the kids chime in and go, "Oh my gosh, that was so much fun. It didn't even feel like I was learning. Was I learning? I don't even know if I was learning." That's how I know I have success, because they can't wait to get back to my room and do another lesson like that. And that's all worth it.